In strategic warfare models, loyalty is considered an irrational variable, but one alien intelligence report proved something terrifying. If a human ever saves your life, they might return years later with an entire fleet. They are not warm people, they are not cold people either, technically. They are the kind of people who, if you asked them for a hug, would hand you a 7-page document outlining the structural inefficiencies of physical contact and then bill you for the consultation. They calculate everything. They weigh everything. Every decision, every word, every resource expenditure filtered through a mind that runs on logic the way a star runs on fusion. Clean, precise, completely exhausting to be around at parties. I know this, because I am one of them. My name is Kale von Dresch, Senior Scout Pilot, 3rd Recon Division of the Vrethian Expeditionary Fleet, and at the particular moment this story begins, I was approximately 47 minutes away from dying in a manner that my people would have described as, quote, statistically foreseeable given the mission parameters, which is Vrethian for you really should have seen this coming, Kale. The asteroid field designated HR-7 by galactic cartographers and called the Grinder by every pilot who had ever flown near it and survived had lived up to its name with what I could only describe as enthusiastic professionalism. My scout vessel, the Precision's Edge, had taken 3 impacts in under 2 minutes. The hull plating on the port side was gone. Not damaged, not compromised, gone. The oxygen recyclers were running at 11%. The power core was flickering like a candle in a windstorm, and my navigation system had, in what I can only assume was a final act of mechanical spite, chosen that exact moment to display the same error message on loop, route recalculation in progress. It was not in progress. Nothing was in progress. Everything was very much the opposite of progress. I did what any Vrethian officer would do in that situation. I ran the numbers. 47 minutes of breathable air remaining. No nearby Vrethian outposts. Galactic Council emergency response time to this sector. Conservatively, 6 hours. The math was not complicated. It did not require a second pass. I was going to die out here, in the dark, next to a field of rocks that had absolutely no opinion about the matter. There is a Vrethian saying, a problem without a solution is simply a fact. We do not panic. We do not beg. We accept facts with dignity, and we prepare our final logs with grammatically correct sentences. I prepared my final log. It was very well written. And then, because I am apparently not as Vrethian as I believed, I sent a distress signal. One signal. A single compressed pulse on the emergency channel carrying my vessel ID, location, and status. I told myself it was procedural. I told myself it was a formality. I told myself that the act of sending it changed nothing because no one was close enough and no one would come, and the log I had just written was genuinely very good and deserved to be found. The signal went out. I watched my oxygen counter tick downward. I listened to the ship groan around me like it was personally offended by the experience of falling apart. 22 minutes passed, and then, a voice crackled through my emergency receiver. A human voice, female, loud in a way that suggested the volume setting on her communication equipment was permanently broken, or she simply had no concept of indoor levels. Hey, is this the little guy with the busted scout ship? Yeah, I'm reading your signal. Hang on, we're coming to you. Petra Solano, freighter Resolute Dawn. Don't you dare float away on me. I stared at my receiver for a full 4 seconds. A human freighter, a commercial vessel, a cargo hauler, almost certainly transporting something deeply mundane, operated by a species that had been part of the Galactic Confederacy for less than 200 years and was still, in the opinion of most senior member species, on a kind of extended probationary status that nobody had officially acknowledged but everyone informally enforced. I checked the signal. I checked it again. I ran a proximity scan. The Resolute Dawn was real. It was close. It was already adjusting its heading toward my coordinates without having asked me a single question about compensation, recovery fees, diplomatic classification, or jurisdictional responsibility. No negotiation, no hesitation, no pause. I found this deeply alarming. The Resolute Dawn reached me in 11 minutes. A tow beam locked onto my hull with a clang that rattled my teeth, and as my broken ship was pulled into the freighter's docking bay, I heard Petra Solano's voice again, still at that extraordinary volume, shouting something to her crew that involved the words, "Get the med kit, somebody move those crates," and inexplicably, "Drogo, if you broke the good blanket again, I swear on the 7 moons I will reassign you to toilet maintenance." I sat in my crumpling cockpit breathing the last of my recycled air, and I thought, these creatures are going to be very confusing to deal with. I had no idea. Here is something they do not teach you in Vrethian Military Academy. They do not teach you what to do when a human woman you have never met in your life throws a blanket over you, looks you dead in your 4 eyes and says, "You look terrible, honey, but we're going to fix that." with the absolute unshakable confidence of someone who has personally defeated worse problems before breakfast. There was no protocol for this. I checked, internally, rapidly, across every social interaction framework the Vrethian Expeditionary Fleet had issued me. Nothing. There was a whole chapter on diplomatic hostage situations. There was a subsection on navigating trade disputes with species who communicated exclusively through bioluminescent patterns. There was nothing, not a single paragraph, about what to do when a large human man named Drogo Bells picks you up off the floor of a docking bay with the gentleness of someone handling a wounded bird, carries you to a recovery pod, and then apologizes, quietly and sincerely, for the fact that the mattress is, quote, not the softest, but it is clean, and I washed the cover myself. Drogo Bells was enormous. He had hands that could have wrapped around my entire head with room to spare. He spoke in a low, careful voice, like a creature that had learned early in life that its size frightened things, and had decided consciously and permanently to compensate with softness. He was the ship's chief mechanic. He had a tattoo on his left forearm of what appeared to be a small cartoon animal holding a wrench, and when I asked him what it was, he looked at it fondly and said, "That's Nugget. My daughter drew it. She was 6. Then he smiled in a way that made absolutely no strategic sense and went back to patching my shoulder wound with steady, practiced hands. I did not know what to do with any of this information. Shen Faro arrived approximately 10 minutes later, which is to say he materialized in the doorway of the recovery bay eating something orange and crunchy from a bag, looking at me with the wide, curious eyes of someone who had just found an interesting rock. He was the navigator. He looked young, absurdly young. The kind of young that made you want to ask him if his parents knew where he was. He was, I later learned, 29 years old, held dual certifications in quantum spatial mapping and electronic systems architecture, and had once rerouted a freighter through an uncharted debris corridor using nothing but manual calculations and what he described as a really solid hunch. He offered me some of the orange crunchy things. I declined. He shrugged and kept eating, leaning against the doorframe, apparently content to simply exist near me without requiring anything in return. This was, I want to be clear, profoundly unsettling. Among the Vreth, presence implies purpose. If someone is near you, they want something, information, resources, a favorable outcome in a negotiation that has not yet been announced. Nobody just stands in a doorway eating snacks at an injured stranger out of something as structurally irrational as curiosity. That is not how intelligent beings operate. And yet, that first evening aboard the Resolute Dawn, Petra's crew of 7 humans did something that I can only describe, clinically, as living. They ate a meal together at a table that was slightly too small for all of them, which meant elbows were involved, and opinions about elbows were loudly exchanged. They played a card game called Ruin, the rules of which appeared to change based on who was explaining them. Drogo won twice, and looked guilty about it both times. A woman named Cassidy Hara, the ship's medic, accused Shen Faro of cheating with a specificity that suggested this was not the first accusation, and Shen Faro defended himself with the energetic righteousness of someone who was absolutely cheating. All of this happened 3 feet from my recovery pod. They were not performing for me. They were not managing my impression of them. They were simply, entirely, completely themselves, at full volume, in my immediate vicinity, without a single moment of calculated presentation. I watched all of it from my pod with what I later described in my personal log as scientific observation. If I am being accurate, it was closer to the feeling of watching a natural phenomenon you cannot classify, something large and chaotic and somehow against all reasonable expectation warm. Petra checked on me twice. The first time she asked if I needed anything and told me the food synthesizer on the ship could do a halfway decent protein broth if my species could handle the base compounds. The second time she sat on the edge of a crate near my pod, and did not say anything for a moment and then said, "You doing okay?" And I mean actually okay, not the version where you say you're fine because you're too proud to say you're not. I told her I was functional. She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded once and said, "All right, but the offer stands," and she left. I lay in that recovery pod, in a human ship, listening to the distant sound of Cassidy Hauer winning the card game and everyone groaning about it, and I thought about the distress signal I had almost not sent. I thought about that for a long time. The Vrethian outpost at Sector Kel 9 came into view on the 3rd day. It was not a beautiful outpost. No Vrethian installation ever was. Beauty was, in the official architectural philosophy of my people, an inefficient allocation of structural resources. Kel 9 was a collection of gray prefabricated modules bolted to a planetoid with the aesthetic sensibility of someone who had been told what a building was, but had never actually seen one. Functional, precise, completely soulless. I had never been so relieved to see anything in my life, which tells you something about the state I was in. Petra brought the Resolute Dawn in on a smooth approach vector, docked at the outpost's external berth with practiced ease, and then walked me to the airlock herself. Drogo had repaired my flight suit, Shen Faro had patched my personal data unit, Cassidy Hauer had redressed my shoulder wound that morning, and given me a small packet of analgesic compounds with instructions written on the outside in handwriting so neat it looked printed. I stood at the airlock. I had prepared a statement. Among the Vreth, the formal acknowledgement of material assistance rendered under emergency conditions follows a specific verbal structure, approximately 43 words, covering the nature of the debt, the assessed value of services provided, and the recorded intention to satisfy the obligation within a legally defined time frame. I began the statement. Petra held up one hand. "Hey," she said, "don't mention it." 4 words. Don't mention it. I stopped. I looked at her. I checked, internally, whether this was a cultural shorthand for a longer formal acknowledgement that I was not yet aware of. It was not. I checked whether it was a deflection preceding a negotiation. It was not. She was already turning to say something to Drogo about a fuel line that needed checking before their next jump. She had saved my life. She had fed me. Her crew had repaired my equipment, treated my injuries, and shared 3 days of their living space with a Vrethian stranger who had, by his own admission, been poor company throughout. And her summary of the entire event was, "Don't mention it." I stepped through the airlock, and then I stopped, right there on the docking bridge, and I opened my personal data unit. I pulled up a fresh entry file, and I recorded with total precision and complete thoroughness every piece of information I had on the Resolute Dawn and its crew. Petra Solano, Captain, biometric profile logged. Drogo Bells, Chief Mechanic, biometric profile logged. Shen Faro, Navigator, biometric profile logged. Cassidy Hora, Medical Officer, biometric profile logged. Vessel registration, hull ID, last known route, home port registry, everything. Among my people, this act has a name, Vrethatal. It translates roughly as debt acknowledged, but the translation is too small for what it actually means. Vrethal is not a feeling, it is not a courtesy, it is a binding internal contract, as legally and morally serious to a Vrethian as anything signed and witnessed in a council chamber. When you record a Vrethal, you are stating, to yourself and to the permanent record of your own conscience, that a debt exists, that it is real, that it has weight, and that it will be honored, not when convenient, not if the opportunity arises. It will be honored, full stop. Humans, as far as my subsequent research could determine, had no equivalent word. What Petra Solano had done for me lived in her internal world, somewhere in the category of the right thing. Not a contract, not an obligation, not even apparently something worth remembering formally, just a thing she had done because it needed doing, and now it was done, and there were fuel lines to check. I found this, genuinely, one of the most disturbing things I had ever encountered. A species that performed acts of profound consequence and then simply, casually, let them go. No ledger, no record, no expectation of return. I closed my data unit. I walked into the outpost. I thought, the fact that they do not keep score does not mean the score does not exist. I kept the file. I kept it for 7 years. 7 years is not a long time cosmically speaking. In 7 years, a mid-sized star does not meaningfully age. A gas giant does not shift its orbit. The asteroid field HR7, which I think about more than is professionally appropriate, continues to grind things up with complete indifference to the passage of time. In 7 years, however, the Galactic Confederacy managed to fall apart with an impressiveness that honestly deserved some kind of award. It started, as most catastrophic things do, with a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation. A trade dispute here, a border reclassification there, a junior diplomatic incident that escalated because someone on the Confederacy Council said something in a session that was supposed to be closed and was not actually closed. The details are complicated and deeply boring and not the point. The point is that by the end of Year 5, the Confederacy was less a unified governing body and more a collection of species who were all in the same room but had stopped making eye contact with each other. And into that fracture, like something that had been waiting precisely for this kind of structural weakness, came the Scarith Dominion. The Scarith were not new. They had existed on the Outer Rim for generations, a militant expansionist culture that the Confederacy had managed through a combination of containment treaties and carefully maintained deterrence. They were disciplined, they were organized, and they had apparently spent the entire period of Confederacy stability doing what disciplined, organized expansionist cultures do when nobody is watching them closely, preparing. When they moved fast. Outer Rim colonies began going dark, not withdrawing, not evacuating, dark. The first 3 were small, lightly populated, the kind of settlements that the inner Confederacy species had never paid much attention to because they produced nothing strategically significant and housed nobody politically important. The Scarith Dominion destroyed them with a thoroughness that made the message unmistakably clear. This was not conquest, this was not occupation, this was removal. The Confederacy convened. The Confederacy deliberated. The Confederacy formed 3 subcommittees and a working group and then deliberated about the working group. The Vreth, my people, looked at the situation with the cold clarity that is our defining characteristic, and we calculated. The Scarith Dominion's projected expansion path did not intersect Vrethian space for a minimum of 11 years. Our military resources, if committed now, would produce a strategic return insufficient to justify the expenditure. The non-aggression treaty the Dominion was offering included favorable trade clauses and an explicit recognition of Vrethian territorial boundaries. We signed it. I will not tell you that I was proud of this. I will tell you that I understood it, which is a different thing and a worse feeling than you might expect. 14 other species made similar calculations. Some signed, some simply went quiet, which is a kind of signing with better deniability. The Confederacy, as a functional military alliance, effectively ceased to exist in the span of about 6 weeks, and then humanity held a vote. I want you to understand what the political situation looked like at this moment. The Scarith Dominion had a fleet that outnumbered the total human naval capacity by a ratio that various analysts placed somewhere between 4-1 and 6-1 depending on how generously you counted humanity's older vessel classes. The Confederacy was fractured. Humanity's 3 willing allies, the Thanali, the Grusk Collective, and a small species called the Orvani, who contributed 12 ships and an enormous amount of moral support, represented a combined force that serious military strategists described in published papers, using words like symbolic and insufficient, and in one particularly blunt Vrethian analysis that I may have authored, strategically negligible. Humanity voted anyway, not a close vote, not a reluctant we have no choice vote, a loud, angry, thoroughly convinced vote. The kind that comes from a species that has looked at the numbers, understood the numbers, and then decided that the numbers had missed something important. The declaration of war was filed on a Confederacy Tuesday. By Confederacy Wednesday, 3 Scarith forward positions had already been probed by human recon vessels. The galaxy watched. I want to be precise about the nature of that watching, because it was not supportive watching, or hopeful watching. It was the specific uncomfortable watching of people who expect to witness something terrible and cannot quite look away. Veteran military analysts from 9 species independently produced projections, and every single projection agreed on the broad outline. Humanity would fight hard. Humanity would fight longer than expected, and humanity would ultimately lose, and the Dominion would be emboldened, and the rest of the galaxy would spend the following decade dealing with the consequences of having done nothing. These were serious analysts, experienced, well-resourced, working from solid data. They were also, every single one of them, about to be extraordinarily wrong, because they had all made the same mistake. They had calculated what humanity had: ships, personnel, weapons, allies, resources. They had measured all of it carefully and found it wanting. Not one of them had calculated what humanity was. That is a very different measurement, and it does not fit neatly into a projection model. Believe me, I tried. By this point in the war I had been promoted to Senior Intelligence Officer, 3rd Analysis Division, Vrethian Expeditionary Command. This meant, in practical terms, that I sat in a very clean room on a very organized station and watched other people's wars through data feeds, signal intercepts, and battle reports. It was precise work, quiet work, the kind of work my people are genuinely excellent at because it requires patience, systematic thinking, and the ability to look at large amounts of information without getting emotionally involved in any of it. I was by every measurable standard very good at this job. And then the human battle reports started coming in. And I want to tell you that my professional detachment remained fully intact throughout, but that would be what humans apparently call a lie. And I have been trying to be accurate. The first report that made me sit forward in my chair was from month 4 of the conflict. A Scarith supply convoy, 17 vessels, heavy escort, operating along the eastern logistical corridor that fed the Dominion's 3 forward fleet positions. This corridor was, strategically, one of the most fortified stretches of space in the active theater. The Scarith knew its importance. They had layered it with patrol routes, automated detection grids, and 2 standing rapid response squadrons that could be on any point of the corridor within minutes of an alert. Every human military analyst and our own Vrethian observers had flagged this corridor as effectively unassailable with the forces humanity currently had available. The math was not subtle. You would need a coordinated strike force of significant size operating with precise timing to have any meaningful chance of disrupting it. Humanity did not have that force available without pulling ships from other active engagements which would create vulnerabilities that the Dominion would immediately exploit. This was the logical assessment. This was the correct assessment. What actually happened was that a single human frigate, registry number HFS 774, operating under the name Absolute Nonsense, dropped out of FTL inside the corridor's inner detection perimeter, which should have been physically impossible given the mass shadow calculations involved, and proceeded to spend the next 41 minutes being the most aggressively annoying military presence the Eastern Corridor had ever encountered. I pulled the full intercept file. I read it 3 times. The Absolute Nonsense had not attacked the convoy directly. It had done something considerably more creative and considerably more infuriating. It had broadcasted on every Scarith military frequency simultaneously a looping signal that mimicked the distress codes of multiple Dominion vessels in multiple locations, which pulled both rapid response squadrons off their patrol routes in opposite directions. It had then physically herded 4 of the convoy's 17 vessels into a debris cluster using nothing but engine wash and precise positional maneuvering, blocking the corridor for 2 hours and 11 minutes. It had disabled the automated detection grid's primary relay with a targeted electromagnetic burst, and then, with what the battle recorder data suggested was genuinely casual timing, it had jumped back out of the corridor and disappeared. Total weapons fire discharged by the Absolute Nonsense during this engagement: 0. Total weapons fire received considerable. None of it connected. The Eastern Corridor was effectively non-operational for 9 days while the Scarith ran diagnostics, reorganized their patrol structure, and I can only assume had some very difficult internal conversations about what had just happened to them. I looked up the commanding officer of the Absolute Nonsense, Captain Petra Solano. I sat with that information for a moment. Then I pulled up my 7-year-old personal file, the one I had kept since Kel 9, and I looked at her name sitting there in my records exactly where I had placed it, and I thought, with a feeling I could not quite classify as any of the standard categories, well, there she is. She had been promoted twice since the freighter days. She had apparently transitioned from commercial shipping to the human naval reserve when the war began, which humans are allowed to do, because humanity is the only species in the Confederacy that maintains a reserve force of civilian-trained pilots who can be federalized in wartime, a policy that every other species had always considered mildly eccentric and now, suddenly, seemed quite intelligent. But Petra Solano was not even the part that broke my analytical framework most completely. That distinction belonged to Shen Faro. The baby-faced navigator with the orange crunchy snacks was, 7 years later, running electronic warfare operations for the entire human Northern Theater. And I use the word running loosely, because what Shen Faro was doing to Scarith communication infrastructure did not fit neatly into the category of electronic warfare as any species had previously defined it. It fit more neatly into the category of what happens when someone who thinks about signal architecture the way other people breathe decides to stop being polite about it. His intrusion algorithms were changing faster than the Scarith could patch them. Our own Vrethian signals analysts, who are among the best in the Confederacy, requested a full copy of his documented methods for study purposes. They received the documentation. They studied it for 3 weeks. Their conclusion, delivered in the flat, precise language of Vrethian technical reporting, was: methodology partially reconstructible, core intuitive framework not reproducible through standard analytical process, recommend further observation. In non-Vrethian language this translates to, we do not fully understand how he is doing this. I had never seen that conclusion in a Vrethian technical report before, not once. Meanwhile, the broader human war effort was displaying a pattern that I kept trying to fit into existing military doctrine and kept failing. They were not following a campaign plan in any recognizable sense. They were following something more like a mood. A Scarith position would be hit not because it was the optimal strategic target, but because a human commander had decided with feeling that it needed to be hit, and had then improvised a method of hitting it that no strategic model had predicted, because no strategic model had accounted for that level of creative aggravation. They called their overall Eastern Theater disruption campaign Operation Loudmouth. They named it themselves. This was not a name assigned by observers or analysts. The humans chose it deliberately, apparently finding it accurate, and filed it under that name in their official military records. I have seen the document. It is real. The header reads Operation Loudmouth, Eastern Corridor Disruption Campaign, Human Naval Forces, and it is stamped with an official seal and everything. I showed this to my commanding officer, Admiral Vrethka Solen. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, in the careful tone of someone revising a previously held position, these creatures are not fighting a war. She paused. They are fighting a grudge. Another pause. I am not certain our models account for grudges. She was not wrong. to Scarith Dominion's eastern flank, which had been projected to hold for a minimum of 2 years under sustained assault by a conventional force 3 times humanity's size, collapsed in month 7, not because humanity had the firepower to collapse it, because humanity was so thoroughly, completely, personally offended by its existence that collapsing it had stopped being a strategic objective and started being a matter of principle. There is a difference. It is not a difference that fits in a projection model. I added 7 new entries to my personal file that month. I was starting to think the file was going to become very important. I want to tell you that we saw it coming. I want to tell you that Vrethian intelligence, with all its precision and systematic thoroughness, had correctly modeled the Scarith Dominion's decision to redirect aggression toward neutral signatories as a logical punitive measure following their eastern flank collapse. I want to tell you that we had prepared, that our defense grids were fully staffed and our rapid response fleets were positioned, and our command structure had wargamed this exact scenario and found it manageable. I can tell you some of those things, not all of them. We had modeled the possibility. That part is true. What we had not correctly modeled was the speed. The Scarith Dominion, stung by 7 months of human-inflicted humiliation across their eastern theater, apparently decided that punishing the species who had signed their treaty and then watched from a comfortable distance was both strategically useful and emotionally satisfying. I understood the logic. I did not appreciate being on the receiving end of it. The first wave hit Vrethian border installations at 0300 station time on a day that I remember with a clarity that has nothing to do with professional record-keeping and everything to do with the specific, visceral experience of watching your home sector's defense net light up red across 17 simultaneous contact points. Our defense systems are formidable. I want to be clear about that because the Vreth do not build anything that is not formidable. Our grid architecture is layered, redundant, and designed by people who treat defensive planning with the same grim thoroughness they bring to everything else. We held. The first wave did not break us. But it hit hard. Hard enough that 3 border installations went to emergency power. Hard enough that our rapid response fleets, repositioning at maximum burn toward the contact points, were running calculations that all produced the same uncomfortable conclusion. The second wave, which Scarith tactical doctrine virtually guaranteed would follow within 6 hours, was going to find us thinner than we wanted to be. I was in the command center at Vrethian Fleet Command, Sector Prime, watching the repositioning feeds and running the numbers for the 4th time in case the 4th time produced a different answer, when the long-range FTL detection array started screaming, not 1 contact, not 2, 3 simultaneous FTL emergence signatures, large-scale, multi-vessel dropping out of faster-than-light travel directly inside Vrethian space, inside our defensive perimeter, at coordinates that should have required either an official Vrethian navigation clearance or an extraordinarily precise set of jump calculations that almost no fleet in the Confederacy could execute with that kind of accuracy. I will tell you honestly that for approximately 4 seconds, every person in that command center stopped breathing. Because 3 fleets dropping uninvited into your home space during an active attack is either the best possible thing that could be happening or the absolute worst, and for 4 seconds nobody knew which one it was. Then the identification transponders resolved on our screens. Human naval forces. Human naval forces. Human naval forces. 3 full human fleets totaling somewhere in the range of 240 vessels had just materialized in Vrethian home space. No prior communication. No formal request for passage. No treaty negotiation, no compensation discussion, no diplomatic clearance filed with any Confederacy body. They had simply apparently decided to be here. And here they were. The command center erupted. Not in the calm, organized eruption of Vrethian officers executing prepared protocols, but in the louder, less dignified eruption of Vrethian officers encountering something for which no prepared protocol existed. And then my personal communication unit, the one tied to my senior intelligence officer credentials, the one whose contact address was not publicly listed and was accessible only through Vrethian military encryption channels, received an incoming signal. I looked at the source identifier, AFSF74. The absolute nonsense. I accepted the signal, static. Then a voice, loud in a way that suggested some things about a person simply never change regardless of how many wars they fight or how many years pass or how many ranks they accumulate. Hey, Kale. Funny running into you. I sat down. I am not certain I chose to sit down. My legs may have made that decision independently. Petra, I said, and then, because I am Vrethian and we are precise people, I added, how did you get this frequency? Shen pulled it, she said, with the breezy tone of someone reporting a minor administrative task. Listen, we saw the contact signatures on your border net about 40 minutes ago. We were already in the neighborhood more or less. The other 2 fleets are Admiral Rook Cassian and Commander Bex Dalloway. Good people. A little intense but good. A brief pause, filled with the distant sound of her bridge crew moving fast and doing things. "We figured you might want some company. We figured you might want some company." That was the entire explanation. No treaty invoked, no debt declared, no formal alliance activated, no political framework cited. They had seen us getting hit, and they had come. And the reason they had come was that they had decided to, and the reason they had decided to was that, apparently this was the kind of thing you did. I thought about the word Vrethal. I thought about Petra Solano standing at an airlock 7 years ago saying don't mention it. I thought about the gap between those two things, the enormous, unbridgeable, deeply human gap between those two things, and I felt something that I can only describe as the specific sensation of a framework you have held your entire life developing a crack down the middle. "Petra," I said, and my voice came out considerably less steady than I would have professionally preferred. "The second wave is projected in approximately 5 hours and 40 minutes. I can transmit our current defensive positioning and the gap coordinates that concern us most. Already pulling your grid data now." Shen Faro's voice cut in from somewhere in the background and I could hear the grin in it without seeing his face. "Hey Kale, long time, Faro," I said. "You still have that file on us?" he asked. "The one with all our biometrics and stuff?" I paused for 1 second. "I do not know what you are referring to." He laughed. It was the same laugh. 7 years and a war, and it was exactly the same laugh. Petra's voice came back and the casual warmth in it had sharpened into something else now. Something focused and clean and very slightly dangerous. "All right, let's talk positioning. We've got about 5 hours and I want your second wave to have a very bad day." "A beat. How are you doing, by the way?" "Actually okay, not the version where you say you're fine." I looked at my screens. 3 human fleets on my defensive grid. 240 vessels where there had been a terrifying gap 6 minutes ago. The second wave still coming. Yes, but coming into something very different now than what it had expected to find. I said carefully, "considerably better than I was." "Good," said Petra Solano. "Now, let's get to work." The Scarith Dominion's second wave arrived into Vreth space 5 hours and 52 minutes after Petra's fleets did. It did not have a good day. I will not walk through the entire battle in detail, partly because the full tactical record runs to several thousand pages, and partly because the most accurate summary is simply this: the Scarith had calculated what they were hitting, and they were wrong, and by the time they understood how wrong they were, Bex Dalloway's fleet had already cut their retreat corridor and Rook Cassian had done something to their command vessel's communication array that nobody on our side fully explained to me afterward, but that resulted in the Scarith Fleet Command spending 47 minutes unable to talk to each other and making a series of increasingly poor individual decisions as a result. The second wave broke. The Dominion pulled back, and the momentum which had been tilting for months already shifted in a way that did not tilt back. 14 months later, the Scarith Dominion formally collapsed. Not surrendered, collapsed. From the inside, under the combined pressure of sustained human military aggression, 3 allied species who had grown considerably braver once it became clear which direction the war was going, and the specific internal strain of fighting an enemy that did not get tired of the fight the way any reasonable enemy should have. The Confederacy, piecing itself back together with the slightly embarrassed energy of people who had let something important break and were hoping nobody had noticed, convened a post-war summit. 17 species sent intelligence and military delegations. The summit lasted 3 weeks. Enormous amounts of data were shared, analyzed, cross-referenced and argued over by some of the finest strategic minds in the known galaxy. The final consolidated report, all 412 pages of it, reached one conclusion that every contributing delegation had independently arrived at before the summit even began. The decisive variable in the Scarith Dominion's defeat was humanity. Not humanity's firepower, not humanity's fleet numbers, not humanity's technology which was good but not exceptional, or humanity's allied support which was present but not overwhelming. The decisive variable was something that 412 pages of post-war analysis struggled to name cleanly, and eventually described as the intersection of tactical unpredictability with an anomalously persistent memory for relational obligations. In non-report language, humans fight like they are personally offended, and they never forget who was kind to them, and these two facts together are more dangerous than any weapon system currently catalogued. 13 of the 17 delegations included some version of a policy recommendation that translated in various diplomatic phrasings to, "Do not make enemies of humans and if at all possible do something nice for one." I wrote my paper 4 months after the summit. I called it The Danger of Being Saved by a Human. It was a serious paper, a genuinely thoroughly serious intelligence assessment, 11,000 words fully cited, peer-reviewed by 3 senior Vrethian analysts who all signed off on its conclusions with the solemn gravity that Vrethian academics bring to important work. It covered the full strategic implications of human relational memory, the unpredictable multiplication effect of human loyalty in military contexts, and the significant danger of any species finding itself on the receiving end of human goodwill, because human goodwill, unlike most resources, apparently compounds over time and then shows up in your home space with 240 ships and no advance notice. The paper was meant as a warning. I submitted it to the Vrethian Intelligence Quarterly. It was picked up by 3 other academic publications. It was then, through channels I did not authorize and still do not fully understand, distributed to 17 Confederacy species intelligence networks, translated into 26 languages, and somehow, within 6 weeks of publication, made its way to a human news aggregator where it was read by approximately 9 million people over a single weekend. Humans found it hilarious. I do not mean they found it mildly amusing. I do not mean they appreciated the analytical rigor while smiling at the framing. I mean they found it the specific kind of hilarious that results in merchandise. Within 3 months of publication, The Danger of Being Saved by a Human was printed on shirts, on mugs, on a line of tote bags that sold out twice. Someone produced a version with my author photograph on it above a caption that read, "He's right, you know," which I discovered when Shen Faro sent me a picture of himself wearing one, grinning in that exact same way he had grinned at me from a doorway with a bag of orange crunchy snacks 7 years and an entire war ago. I stared at that picture for a long time. I thought about writing a follow-up paper. I had already drafted the title Further Evidence Supporting the Original Conclusions of the Danger of Being Saved by a Human, with specific reference to recent merchandising data. I did not write it. I felt it would only make things worse, or, knowing humans, significantly more entertaining, which I was beginning to understand was often the same thing. I retired on a Tuesday. Vrithians do not make ceremonies out of retirement. There is no gathering, no speech, no moment where colleagues stand in a room and say things about you that they perhaps should have said earlier. You file the paperwork, you hand in your access credentials, you walk out. It is efficient, it is clean, it is, I have always thought, exactly right. I spent my first day of retirement in the Vrethian Central Archive at Sector Prime. Not because I had been asked to, not because anything required my presence there. I went because there was a file I wanted to look at, and I had been meaning to look at it properly for a long time, and I had run out of reasons to postpone. I pulled up the original distress log from the Precision's Edge, the one I had recorded 47 minutes before dying, in a broken ship next to an asteroid field that had not cared about me in the slightest. The log was well written. I had not been wrong about that. My final entries were grammatically correct and professionally composed and completely, utterly beside the point, because I had not died, and the reason I had not died was sitting in a separate file 3 clicks away. I opened the crew manifest of the Resolute Dawn. Petra Solano, Drogo Bells, Shen Faro, Cassidy Haro, and 3 others whose names I had logged with the same precision, the same thoroughness, the same absolute Vrethian commitment to recording what was real and what was owed. I looked at those names for a while. Then I pulled the battle records from the defense of Sector Prime, the FTL emergent signatures of 3 human fleets, the communication log with timestamp, frequency, and full transcript, Petra's voice rendered in text saying, "Hey Kale, funny running into you." I thought about Vrithal. Debt acknowledged. Debt real. Debt weighted. Debt to be honored. I had carried that word for years like a stone in my chest, solid and serious in mine. I had been so certain that it was the correct framework, that what Petra had done for me existed inside that framework, that her showing up in my home space 7 years later confirmed the framework, that the framework was, ultimately, what explained all of it. But sitting in that archive on the first day of my retirement, looking at a name that had never once used the word debt, I began to wonder if I had been, in the very precise and very Vrethian way that my people are sometimes wrong, completely missing the point. Petra had never called it a debt. Not once. Not at the airlock. Not on the communication channel with Scarith Fire incoming. Not in any of the messages we had exchanged in the years since, which had become, without either of us formally deciding this, a genuine correspondence. She had called it the right thing. She had called it the obvious thing. She had called it once, in a message that arrived on a Vrethian holiday I had not mentioned to her but that she had apparently looked up. Just what you do. Just what you do. I sat with that for a long time. The archive was quiet around me. Efficient. Precise. Completely soulless in the way all Vrethian spaces are. And I had always found this exactly right. And I still found it exactly right. And I also found myself thinking about a table that was slightly too small for 7 people, and a card game with flexible rules and a blanket that someone had washed themselves. I still do not fully understand humans. I have accepted this. It is not a failure of analysis. It is not a gap in my methodology. It is simply a fact about the universe, the way the size of certain things resists complete measurement no matter how good your instruments are. But I have reached one conclusion that I hold with total certainty. More certainty than anything else in my 34 years of professional intelligence work. More certainty than any model, any projection, any assessment I have ever filed, of all the things in this galaxy that might notice you, that might remember you, that might one day decide that what happened between you matters and act accordingly. Without treaty, without negotiation, without waiting to be asked, there is nothing more worth having in your corner than a human who once decided you were worth saving. Every other species in this galaxy will calculate whether you deserve help. Humans have already decided. Pray, if you pray to anything, that one of them remembers your name, because they will come, they always come, and they will be loud about it, and they will crack jokes on your emergency